Hello, greetings. Today we're covering the game between Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces and Grand Master Loek Van Wely with the black pieces. And this is from the Tata Steel tournament that is taking place right now, round 9. Um, this game was pretty exciting, and Magnus came out on fire because he basically blew 2 games in a row. So he is not playing games today. So he comes out with e4, c5, knight of 3, e6, Paulson variation, d4, open Sicilian, c takes, knight takes d4, knight f6, so all main line stuff. Knight c3, and what are we going to get? Are we going to get a knight off here with a6? No, we get d6. And this, my friends, is known as the Skyfenagen formation. Some people say Shaveneggen, but I think it's pronounced Skyfenagen. Anyway, this is a very important formation and structure to understand um, in chess, and I'll take a minute just to explain it to you right now. Okay, so let's look at this from White's perspective. I know some of you out there are like, man, this is just a regular Sicilian position, just move on. But again, I'm always thinking of my beginning um, players that might not understand. And I know some of you guys have been playing a long time, don't understand because you're just playing by rote and repetition, and not really understanding the position properly. So here we go. With First of all, we're gonna look at it from White's perspective. From this position, and again, this position can show up from a knight off variation, Solzen variation, which would be like a6 and then bishop c4. Um, again, the Skyfenagen, um, knight off Richter Rouser, bishop g5, and ideas queen d2, castle and queen side. So you get this position in this Sicilian a lot, and I'm sure many of you have seen it, hundreds of times. What White's main ideas are thus: one is to try to get e4, e5 in. Of course, not from this position, but down the road. So this is when you see a lot of plans involving f4 and then e5. That's one plan. That's basically an attacking plan. Just trying to bulldoze white, black in the center, taking control of the e5 square, driving the pieces away, and setting the basis, setting the tables for a kingside attack. Another plan, and I'm sure you've seen this in a lot of games, is f4, right? But having f4, but not to play e5, f4 with the intention of playing f5. The idea of that is to undermine the support of d5 here. So after say f4, f5, for instance, and this pawn comes here, just forget about the knight on d4 for a second. This pawn comes here, and e5 is now vulnerable to occupation by the knight. And oftentimes you'll see that in conjunction with the bishop being here, getting rid of this knight on f6, and then white uses the d5 square as an outpost, either after f4, f5, and this e5 push or some type of exchange here. Okay, the other plan is, let's get rid of that graphic. The other plan is, again, g4 and g5. And again, you see it in combination with other moves. So for instance, you might see f4 and then g4, g5 with the big pawn storm. And that's just, again, an attempt, a real aggressive attempt to blow black off the board. Okay. Um, Basically, also, I want to say that white has given up in the beginning of the game, right? And I know these are some basic concepts. In the beginning of the game, white has given up this d pawn in exchange for black c pawn. So this is a net plus for black because the d pawn is more valuable than the c pawn. So you might say, well, why is white doing that? Well, chess is a game of exchanges, right? And not only exchange of material, but exchange of circumstances and exchange of disadvantages and advantages. Right? It's a game of give and take. So in this case, white is willing to give up his central pawn, which is the D pawn, in exchange for black C pawn. So what is white arguing, or what is white getting in return? White is getting an advantage in space. As you can see, his occupation of 4 ranks, and he gets the initiative for the central pawn. Okay, so that's good for white. What is black getting? Well, black is getting in exchange the pawn preponderance in the center, which is great because this makes it very difficult, right, for white to control the e5 and d5 squares. Right, let's move up. Notice with these pawns here, look how much much space they control. It's very difficult for white to operate on these squares. So black gets a pawn majority in the center. What else does he get? By exchanging a C pawn for the D pawn. He also gets this operation down the C file, which also allows further queenside counterplay. And this is why you see many plans in the Sicilian with A6 and B5, because it's all connected and it's a natural consequence of having the C file being open. Okay, so A6, B4, B5 with counterplay. Okay, and also with that B pawn advancing, that leads to an with the B pawn advancing, that leads to an indirect attack on this pawn. Sorry about that. Because after A6, B5, B4, this knight is attacked, which is protecting the pawn in E4, and you have that. Okay. Black's other plans include, and as many of you may know, is getting in the D5 push, right, which is countering the center. Basically, to hold white's pawn here and then get this break in, which usually will free black's game immediately, and oftentimes he's better. That's another plan. And often you'll see the plans combined: queenside counterplay, central thrust, etc. Other plan for black is to advance the E pawn, which it has more of a blockading effect, and you'll notice these variations a lot after, say, white plays, for instance, moves like bishop E2 and the knight off, and then you'll get like these type of setups. Okay, so those are the general plans in a nutshell, or the general ideas in the Sicilian proper for black and white. And so this formation is very important to understand that those major plans for each side. This is, again, it's called the Schieffelingen formation. All right, so let's go on with the game. G4. Okay, and I just explained to you the basic plans of white and black, and we see an aggressive move by Magnus Carlsen. Again, like I said, he is basically blew the last 2 games. He missed a mate in 3, which is well known all across the internet and chess world right now, against Gary, and he also lost the game against Richard Report. So he is basically probably has smoke coming out of his ears right now. This, my friends, is known as the Keres attack, and this is named after Estonian Grandmaster Paul Keres, which has the aggressive idea of basically setting up the pawn storm against the black king side. Okay, so I've given you the general plans in the Sicilian, but let's talk about the specific plans in this particular variation, the Keres variation. Again, they're all related. So I already told you that about the pawn storm scenario. So this is a very aggressive continuation. So white wants to play, of course, G4, moves like H4, H5, G4, G5 in some circumstances, even adding the move F4 in. It's a real aggressive system. Also, rook to G1. Then sometimes uh, after black moves this pawn to play g4, g5, and then bishop to g5. Um, then after the bishop is out, then the play moves like queen to d2 and castle queenside. So it's a very, very aggressive system. What does this mean? This means that even though black's plan is to counter on the other wing, the speed um, of white's attack is such that black must take time to counteract. Remember, I told you at the beginning that in exchange for white giving up his d pawn for the c pawn, that he does gain an initiative. So white's attack comes fast. So it's so fast that black doesn't really have time to just ignore it and go along with his queenside counterplay. First, he must make some type of restrictive moves, and that's what usually happens in this attack. So black will play moves like h6 or h5, trying to just slow down or provoke white into blocking up the position, and which has the net effect of slowing down the white attack. Okay, then after once he does that, once he kind of like neutralizes white's aggressiveness there, then he counterattacks on the queen side with the plans I mentioned before. Moves like a6, bishop d7, for instance, b5. Okay, what else? Other ideas are knight c6 to knight e5, and then coming to c4. All right, and then of course, as I mentioned, the timely d5 or e5 is an option. One thing that's usually not an option here is for black in this variation is queenside castling. So even though white is storming on the king side, it's usually safer for black to stay on e8 with this king instead of castling queenside. Okay, so those are the basic ideas, and of course, this is why the Sicilian is one of the most popular or the most popular reply to e4. It's real dynamic. Black has counter chances, and there's many classic games as a result of the pawn formation. Okay, let's go on now. g4, there it is, h6, and bishop g2. Of course, there's many ways to play. f4, h4 could rook g1, etc. There's many different plans in the position, but it's suffice it to for now just to know the general ideas. And then if you want to, you can look up the Keres attack or Skyfinagan games and stuff like that. All right, so knight c6, h3, g5. So we see again. I really don't like g5 that much, but we see the idea of black trying to basically neutralize the white's movement on the king side before he again the general plan. So he chose to do g5. Instead of maybe just playing a natural looking move by bishop e7. He possibly didn't want that to happen. So he plays g5, which is really committal move. And committing, early in the game. At some point, a move like h4, h5, attacking his pawn, might be crucial. Okay, so g5 is really committal, but again, it has the same idea in mind of just um, pausing white's kingside aggression, and also it prevents the move f4, and therefore it makes it easier for the knight to come and sit on e5. Okay, so Magnus decides to trade the knight, right? So he just basically deads this idea of this knight coming here. Okay, bishop e3 is possible, but then with the bishop e3, perhaps knight e5, and then it's hard to get this knight out of here. So you have, for instance, say like queen e2, and let's just go with general plans by black. A6, castle. Notice how all these moves are based on the plans. Of course, there'll be slight variations due to tactical and strategical themes in the position. So f4, let's try to get rid of them, right? G takes, bishop takes f4. And of course, we see this opposition of the rook down here. So queen c7. Okay, so you got a dynamic game. You know, the knight has this access to here. Notice the king still here in the middle, kind of protected, you know, by these pawns. Okay, so that's like a typical sequence that can happen. So back to the game, Magnus wanted to prevent that knight from getting to e5, so he just trades it off. Now, again, chess is a game of give and take, so he trades the knight, right? So he kind of like gives up some time there, and he builds up the black center by allowing the b pawn to become a c pawn. And now white's counterplay moves from the c file to the b file. Okay, so this is an interesting take. So we kind of altered the pawn structure here. Okay, so here's Magnus' idea. Okay, now the bishop is attacking his pawn, and also x-raying through to that rook here. All right. Now, at first glance, I mean, I like to move knight d5 here. Okay. And this is what Van Wely did. Knight d5. He takes d6. And he decides to take with the queen. Bishop take d6 is definitely an option. It seemed like more natural move, but we can't see an argument for putting the bishop on this nice diagonal also. Right? It makes sense putting the bishop there on g7. And then along with this counterplay of the rook on the b file. Right? And then perhaps even moving the queen out here on this diagonal at some point. So we can see an argument for both sides. One thing I would say in favor of taking with the bishop here is that here the bishop is a bit more flexible. And if you need the bishop on this diagonal, on the a1 to h8 diagonal, then you can at some point, say for instance castle, you can kind of slip the bishop in there. You know, and then maybe after rook e1, queen c7. Like you can get the bishop on the diagonal if you want to. So bishop d6 is perhaps a bit more flexible. But I don't think that's like a make it or break it thing. It's more of a preference. So he chose queen d6. And this basically commits the bishop somewhere else. Okay. Another thing is by bringing the queen here to d6, you know, the queen, you know, is susceptible to attack from the knight. Magnus castles. Bishop a6. Rook e1. And this is an interesting pawn structure here because I would say I would give the advantage to white. I mean, it's a slight advantage just due to the weak pawn structure of black here. With this early h3, h6 and g5. This pawn structure looks a little bit loose. I mean, it's not a big deal, but it looks a little bit loose. Where white's pawn structure looks a little bit more fluid, although he's weakened himself a little bit on the king side also. Only difference is that black's bishop on c1 is putting a lot of pressure on these pawns, whereas where black does not have the same pressure placed on the white pawns on g4 and h3. So that's the difference. Okay, so he plays bishop e7. Now, I think knight takes c3 is interesting. Trying to double up white's pawns here. Queen takes d6. Bishop takes d6. then you got to deal with this right here. And that's like it's kind of like the deal breaker there. Right? You do a move like that. And then rook takes e2. Bishop takes e2, bishop e4. And you have a pretty interesting game there. But again, I will give the nod to white here. I like this 3-1 queen side pawn majority. I'll take that any day over the black side of the position. By the way, on knight e2, if white tries to just say, I don't know, go here to king h1, then he's just down material. Okay, so he has to, so in that line he has to, give back the exchange there. All right. So that was an option. Now here, again, this is part of the downside of black taking here with the queen, because he's facing problems with development now. Of course, he would like to just put the bishop here on g7, but now you have this problem with the pin on the e file. If the knight takes d5, c takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes d5, bishop takes d5 with the attack on the rook on the a8. The pin is not, the pin keeps the bishop from being captured on d5. Has to do something like that. And then the bishop just drops back to f3. Again, this is killer for white. This 3-1 majority on the queen side. So therefore, Van Wely is facing some logistical problems, and due to that capture earlier with the queen on d6, as opposed to capturing with the bishop and developing. So he probably didn't foresee that problem. So now, instead of being able to place the bishop kind of where he wants to put it, he has to play bishop e7. Okay. Pressure from Magnus. And like I said, now the queen is vulnerable to the attack. And now, after the queen is hit, now it's easy to bump this knight out with c4. Right? These are all like no-brainer moves to me. Knight b4, and of course, Van Wely wants to bring the rook over. And this square has become a little weak now, so Van Wely is trying to jump in there. He would like to play rook d8 real quick, and then pop that knight in there. So the problem is, I see right now, is that there's a little bit of looseness to the black position. These pieces seem a little uncoordinated. Okay, so simply b3. Okay. Now let me explain to you why bishop takes c4 did not occur. The reason is because there's this thing called the double of attack. And this is what happens when your pieces are uncoordinated, when you have loose pieces. Loose pieces are unprotected pieces, right? They're uncoordinated. They're not protecting each other. They're just kind of like randomly going rogue on the battlefield, so to speak. So this is why bishop c4 is not possible. But again, as I was saying, just looking at the position in general, pieces just look randomized. Right? This is not good. Notice how white's pieces are a little bit more in harmony here. Everything is pretty much protected except this rook on a1. The bishop is guarding over the knight as well as the rook. King's guarding the bishop. Queen and rook mutually guard each other. Bishop is protected. So that adds the glue in communication with the pieces adds some strength to the position. Whereas when you look at the black pieces, you see the rook on a8 kind of by itself, bishop on a6, rook on h8 just hanging there, right? The pawn is on c4 attacking the knight. Okay, so c4, knight b4. Now b3 is played, and rook d8. Okay, so Van Wely has this idea. Queen to f3. And he does what he wants to do. He hops right in there to d3. Now this is a very important square, so Magnus has to fight for it immediately. Right? You can't have your opponent just hanging out on d3. Okay. Okay, so now black secures the bishop here. Right, but it cost him some time. I mean, he jumped top that knight around a few moves. Okay, so he has the bishop here. Interesting in this position is that it's pretty much closed still. And so the bishops aren't really that powerful right now. Notice this bishop on a6 is kind of blocked off. So Van Wely's going to have to work hard to bring that bishop into the game. So having the bishop here in this position is really not, not as good as you might think. This dark square bishop, however, is a monster for black. This is a good bishop. I mean, there's plenty of diagonals to choose from here. And this knight right here doesn't really have any outpost at this moment. All the outposts that the knight would like to be on are kind of blocked. D5 is covered by pawns. B5 is covered by pawns. And F5 is covered by the pawn. So this knight is in a good spot now, but it's kind of unstable. In an ideal world, this pawn would like to be on c5, and you would like to stick this knight right here on d6 as an outpost. So that's a potential plan in the position, as well as fixing, get rid of some graphics, as well as fixing this pawn on a light square so that the bishop can attack it at some point. So let's keep moving. Queen f4 is interesting. Going into this end game. I'm not sure about going into the end game right now. I mean, because I think white's pawns are better. And maybe he should just wait on that. Why not just perhaps just castle here? He's slightly worse, but maybe just castle. I don't think it's premature to run into this endgame though. So he offers Carlsen the endgame, and Carlsen does what I think most guys would do here. Is just exchange. Right? Rook takes d8, bishop takes d8, queen takes f4, g takes f4. So now you have this. Pawns are even worse than they were before. Right? These would be called pawn islands. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4 pawn islands. Right? So black, I don't know, it's going from slightly worse to worse. Even though he has the two bishops, still it's I think he made a mistake with that queen f4 move, because he has a lot of pawn weaknesses for Magnus to try to attack. Knight c5. So the knight doesn't really have an outpost, but has opportunities to attack. So that gives the knight some time. This bishop is bad basically. Right, so he attacks the bishop and this pawn is attacked simultaneously. So remember the plan I had mentioned earlier about bringing the pawn to c5, fixing this pawn. Well, Magnus does it using the knight. So the knight fixes the pawn, bishop is attacked, simultaneously, and he just picks up a pawn. And now we have realized what I've been mentioning throughout the game is this 3-1 queenside majority. We're just gonna keep moving through the game, and like I said, the unfortunate thing for Magnus here is this knight doesn't really have a stable outpost, so as soon as it's attacked, it has to move. Again, it's attacked again, and now we see Magnus with the threat. Bishop d7, and there we go. And notice again, speaking about coordination, notice how the bishop and the knight are combining to cover the c6 square, right? And this rook is behind this pawn, and it all aids in the advance of the pawn by taking over the squares in front. Now, Magnus has this threat. It has to be addressed because he's threatening to win the rook, because Van Wely would love to play this move here and just blockade everything, but he can't because he would lose to knight c6 check. So he has to take time to address that, and this pawn moves. c5, bishop a5. Again, the weakness of white's position would be this knight not having an outpost. But notice, Magnus understands, but now look what he has. Right? This pawn has control over the d5 square. So now, utilizing, the skillful maneuvers of the knight, and with tempo, right, if he wants, he can arrange, maneuver in a way to get his knight here. Good move, rook c4, just attacking weakness in the position. And notice how the position still remains generally closed, so that Magnus cannot really shine with, so that Van Wely can't really shine with the bishop here, right? Rook c8, of course the idea is, if rook takes f4, then black will take here. He just pushes, right? This is coordinated piece play. Notice how all three of the pieces are contributing to the advance of this passed pawn. Okay, so bishop takes b4. So he finally gives up his really only plus in the position, which is the bishop here. Takes b4. Bishop takes c6. Bishop takes c6. Rook takes. And he takes the pawn, the f pawn. Now, we have to mention that he could have taken this pawn also. Coming to me, that's more natural. Come to the 7th rank and say after king d6, rook takes, and now you have two free pass pawns. This pawn is weak anyway, so that pawn will fall at a later time. So that's, to me, that's more of an option, and you have a tempi against this, so it's not like black can play a move like that, because this pawn would just drop. So I would think that was, a little more straightforward to the point. It's just clear the path for these two pawns to run up the board. Okay. So Magnus decides to take this pawn instead. See, now he plays a5, and of course he wants to trade down the majority of white's pawns. Now the thing is with a5, usually what this is what I've read throughout the years, is that sometimes when you're fighting against a majority, you want to, of course, cripple the majority from, try to keep it from moving, or double up, devalue the pawns in some way, double up the pawns. But sometimes when you move the pawn forward, like for instance, this pawn a5, sometimes you make it easier for the opponent to create a majority in the position. So, and I know the idea is real simple. Like for instance, b4, right, which would be like an unconscionable move. Then rook c1, king g2, and then that would just be totally unacceptable. But bringing a pawn here, to me, makes it easier for white to achieve the passed pawn. Maybe if rook a6, for instance, just attacking directly, Magnus would have to play a4, rook d6, b4, a6, with some pressure on the pawns. But I mean, Van Wely is still lost. I mean, after, for instance, rook c4 with the idea of coming up here. So anyway, Van Wely played a5, king g2, and there's just too much weakness in black's position. I mean, it's hard to stop the king from going anywhere he wants to exploit these pawns. The king just has too much leeway. His outside passer threat is going to keep black tied up on the queen side, and there's no way to keep Magnus from penetrating. So while he distracts the opponent on one side of the board, he'll be penetrating on the other side, and vice versa. So it doesn't matter where black chooses to set up his defense. Rook c5, h4. Of course, he would love to create a passed pawn here with these pawns. So he stays on the 5th rank. King f3, f6. Of course, designed to hinder the movement of these pawns. King e3, h5, f3. I mean, that's playable, but it kind of makes the job a little bit more difficult. Normally, you just keep the pawns together. That's what he does, f3. So if takes, you got this passer. This will be a passer right here. Let me just show you. And this baby is going up the board. Okay. So he takes, which to me is I don't know, like it's basically almost resignable here. I mean, if rook e5 check, rook e4. I mean, anything but take. I don't think. Excuse me. I don't think black can't really take there. That's not acceptable. I mean, taking here, he's creating another, outside passer on this side. So there's gonna be one on this side and the king side. Okay, rook d1. Notice the activity of white's rooks. That's one of the main principles in rook endings, is always keep your rook active, even if you have to sacrifice pawns. Don't have a passive rook. Okay, nobody's concerned about that check on e1. And it's real simple chess. I mean, many different kind of moves can be played here. Like h5 is the most obvious. Magnus played rook to c4. Rook d5. And finally h5. Rook d2. Van Wely dreaming and hoping and praying for a perpetual check. Rook d5. King e3. Rook g5. So it's like how to make progress, right? You have this guy here. There's pressure here. And again, like I said earlier, while the opponent is trying to stop the pawns on one side of the board, you just attack on the opposite side. Rook c4, king d6. Notice the king, rook coming to c4. King's cut off. The knight, the king improves itself. Rook d5. And now Magnus takes over the 8th rank, already paving the way for this pawn. Meaningless check. And now we see one of the major principles, right? The second major principle. So the first one of the rooks was maintaining an active rook. The second major principle is rooks belong behind passed pawns. And we see that right here now. Magnus has his rook behind the passed pawns. And that's not only passed pawns, but also behind the enemy pawns. So if white was trying to push his pawns up the board, right? So the theory would have it where the rooks belong behind passed pawns. So if these pawns are going up, you want your rooks behind passed pawns, because the rook gains in power as the pawns move forward. The rook gains more scope. If we were trying to push these pawns up, the rook belongs behind the passed pawns. When it comes to defensive measures, right? So in other words, these pawns are going down. In theory, you want your rook behind the passed pawn. Behind. And that's what Magnus does. So he puts his rook in the optimal location, gets behind this pawn, which plays a defensive role on one end, and on the other end, he plays an attacking role in escorting the h pawn up the board. Rook f3, another check, right? Doesn't really mean anything. Now, any move is possible at this point. For instance, king f4. If he goes here, then you just snatch that. Okay, king g2, check. King f3. Another check. Now let me just show you, the real obvious. If rook takes a2, then you just push. You just push this guy. And right, so you're saying, hey, what about that move? Well, this is old rook tactics right here. Right, you just simply push the pawn. Now you're threatening to promote. And once the rook takes, look at these guys. Look at this. You study enough rook endgames, that'll be clear as day to you. Those kind of themes, because they occur very often. You would just play that and just pick up the rook. This is why Carlsen is not worried about this pawn being snatched. So Van Wely goes for the repeated checks. And finally, he just picks up another free pawn. And of course, at this time, Van Wely can just resign. Okay, so here's the last desperate attempt to go for the queen. h6, e3, a7. He plays that again. You might be wondering, well, what about h2? Right? Simply play rook a7, king d6, and then the queen. This is kind of like what happened in the game. Then black just ends up losing the queen d8. Now he has to go back to king e5. He has to go back to the e file. He's gonna lose the queen. Right? So he goes back here, just real simple, and then you pick up the queen. So of course the other move to think about is, well, what if he tries to, keep things going? Well, then he ends up getting checkmated. You just run this on him, rook c7, king b4, and then you just make sure he can't escape out this way. So you play a move like Queen D6, right? That forces him back over. So let's say King B5, and now you should be able to see the mate from here. You know, just simply A4, King A5, and Rook A7. So of course Magnus, seen all of this, and Van Wely sees it too. So he just goes here, right? King D6, and there it is. Rook Rook guards the eighth rank. King is guarding this. And one more move, and he resigned. So that was it, because the next move is just queen. So that was a good comeback game from Magnus Carlsen. He had the right opponent. That he was, not that Van Wely is weak, but he is over 100 points lower rated than Magnus. So Magnus is supposed to, according to statistics, beat him most of the time with the white pieces. And I hope that was an instructive game. As usual, please like, subscribe, support the channel, you know. And I hope you learned a little bit about the Sicilian in that game, and also a little bit about rook endings. All right, I'll see you on the next one.